Thank you very much. Thank you, beautiful people, for clapping me. Okay, so hello, I'm Igor. I'm from Eki, and I'm going to talk about signing with Apple in real life. So I think most of you remember WWDC 19. A lot of people were watching. It was a really big keynote. More than 1.8 million people were watching this event live. We've got introduced, for example, very cool $1,000 worth screen stand, which I believe every one of us use, and it really makes our developer lives easier. But no, seriously, I feel like WWDC 19 was, after a long time, a keynote which was really for developers, and there were a lot of cool new features introduced for us, for developers, like, for example, Swift UI. And another thing was signing with Apple. So let's start by saying what signing with Apple is. It is a privacy and security focused single sign-on service, which is some alternative to other social logins in your app like Facebook or Google. It promises fast, secure, but most importantly, privacy friendly experience. And the question is why we should use it. Well, we should use it because it is mandatory for all apps using other third-party login services. So yeah, one way or another, we will eventually all stick to using sign-in with Apple. Another question was if somebody will actually use it. So we're forced or we have to use it, but will actually our users sign in with Apple? Well, we don't have statistics from our apps, but I have found this really interesting statistic from an app called Mezzanine. It's some theater diary app. And we can see that before sign-in with Apple was implemented in this app, half of the users were using login via email, and the other half was using Google or Facebook. When sign-in with Apple was introduced, the percentage of email users stayed approximately the same, from 40 to 50%, but a lot of users who would use Facebook or Google actually used Apple sign-in, which we can see was almost 42%. So I think it's a really nice alternative, and Apple users will use it. So before I go any further, I will ask how many of you have actually implemented sign-in with Apple in your apps? Okay, that's not a big number. So I have a little basic implementation flow. I've got a lot of code here, but I will try to go through this pretty fast. So first of all, you add a capability to your project. You add it to your developer portal. I believe all of you know this. Then you use new framework introduced with iOS 13, which is called Authentication Services. Well, basically to authenticate with Apple account, you first sign in the user to the Apple account using this framework. Then for every sign-in request, you generate a random string called nonce and hash it with SHA 256, which is basically important just to prevent some attacks. And then Apple does all the hard work for you, and it packs all the UI and all the logic in the AS authorization controller and its delegate methods. You can see I mentioned Firebase there. I don't know how many of you use Firebase to manage social logins, but we do, because it helps a lot of things and it is basically easier to use. So this is how the starting of Apple sign-in flow looks like. You basically initialize the Apple ID authorization provider, you generate this random non-string, then you create Apple ID provider request, you define the scopes, which usually in your apps would be full name and email, then you hash the nonce, put it into the request, and you initialize the AS authorization controller with this request and perform requests. Nothing too complicated so far. Next, you handle the Apple's response using the mentioned AS authorization controller delegate, which has two basic functions: did complete with authorization and did complete with error, where you handle your errors. So the implementation could look like this. You take the Apple ID credential from the authorization, then you get the Apple ID token, then you generate a string from this token, and then you use all of this to create a credential and sign the user in, and voila, user has successfully signed in with Apple. Easy, right? The last thing you probably need to do is to manage the private email relay service. As you may know, you can the users have a possibility to hide their mail. So for example, like my mail would be hashed into something like this at privaterelayappleid.com. And basically what you need to do is to manage that every email, if you are sending, for example, welcome emails or any other emails from your app, have to be redirected from this private relay email to the real email of user, because you don't have access to this real email address. So you must register just your outbound SPF email domain, and then register this email address you will use to contact your customers. All of this you will do in the developer portal. Also, it's not a big deal. Another cool feature about signing with Apple actually is that it's not only for iOS users, it is also possible to implement it for Android and web. Basically, it doesn't have such a nice and native feeling than on iOS, but it works. The basic flow is you just create another ID, which is called service ID. You generate a private key, then you send it to the web. They will handle it, and when user on Android or on web tries to sign in with Apple, he's presented with a web view where he can sign in. So nothing complicated. And when everything is successful, it looks something like this. You define your name, you choose whether you want to share your mail or hide your mail, and in the ideal situation, you are successfully signed in. Well, nice, right? Easy. Well, actually, yeah, I'm going to talk about signing with Apple in real life, how it looks like in real implementation. So, first of all, Apple is really serious about its branding, so they offered us this really nice native sign in with Apple button, which is really easy to use. You just define a few lines. You have the original native AS authorization Apple ID button, which you can use to sign in your users. Perfect. But then you start to actually use it, and you find out that you can manually adjust the font size of this button. You can adjust the size of the button itself, but you can't adjust the font size. So you probably might expect that the font size will be getting bigger as the frame expands, but as you can see, this little fella in the middle, no, it doesn't. And it actually acts pretty unpredictably. Another thing is it doesn't natively adapt to light and dark mode, so you of course have to handle that yourself. And probably the biggest hassle, it's actually not a UI button, but it's UI control. So I guess hooray selectors. Well, you just cannot use primary action to bind an action to it. You have to use good old selectors. Another thing I would like to talk about is testing the app. Basically, when you register your user for the first time or log in for the first time, you don't have any chance to change the Apple ID which you use to log in. You are presented with this controller, and you can either continue or press cancel. But let's say you are debugging and you want to change the Apple ID, you want to change the Apple name, you want to hide or unhide the email address and test how it behaves. So every time you want to do this, you actually have to go to your settings, Apple ID, passwords and security, Apple ID logins. You have to find your app name, and then you need to press to stop using Apple ID, and you have to do this each time you want to test the sign in with Apple login with a different email or just test it again, which can take a lot of time and isn't very nice. But yeah, okay, whatever. Another thing, user info or user profile info. You can easily take user identifier, full name, and email as we define it in the authorization scope. Yeah, nice, indeed, complete authorization delegate. You just take it out and you use it, right? But you can only retrieve the full name and the email for the first time you sign in the user. Each time the user signs in again, these credentials will literally return you empty strings. And this is, of course, not a bug, it's a feature, and it is confirmed by Apple staff. So yeah, we have to deal with it. So we have to make sure that we save it on the first registration and store it either in our database or repository or whatever. And you can retrieve a photo at all, which I also think would be a nice feature, because you can have a photo assigned to your Apple ID, but you can use it in your app, like for example from Facebook. Yeah, you just can. And as I mentioned, we are using Firebase, and in the Firebase documentation, you can find this, that you can take these Apple credentials, the full name, mail, and everything from current user display name, but it's not true. It's not working. Even if it is in the documentation and it literally says you can do it, no, you can't. You have to just do it manually. Okay, I'm going to talk about CryptoKit. I don't know if some of you know about it, but basically it is a new framework also introduced with iOS 13. It's not necessarily signing with Apple related, but as I mentioned, you have to hash your nonce, which you send with your request. And we have decided to use CryptoKit for this purpose. So it is basically a library that performs cryptographic operations securely, efficiently. It provides access to a lot of cryptographic functions. It has a nice Swift API. It's really easy to use. But it's also a strong framework. What I mean by this is when you try to launch app which imports CryptoKit on older than iOS 13, your app will crash instantly when you start the app. It just says no suitable image found for CryptoKit. And it takes a little bit of Googling before you find that Xcode is not properly adding CryptoKit to the linked frameworks list. Nobody knows why. But you must, again, manually add the weak framework flag in your app's target to use CryptoKit in your app. Otherwise, it will run only on iOS 13. Yeah. And speaking about iOS 13, yes, I believe most of you know that, but signing with Apple is only available for iOS 13. You can't implement it for the older iOSs. We were thinking about trying implement it on Android-like or web-like, so you will be like transferred to WebView where you can handle it, but we are not really sure about whether we should do it or not, because we are a little afraid that it may get rejected because it is not the desired experience for Apple or for App Store reviews. So we are not quite sure about this, but if you try it, please tell me. I'm really curious about this. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is documentation/guidelines. Well, we all know how Apple documentation most of the time looks like, but I would like to focus on guidelines. When Apple released Sign with Apple, there were like no guidelines at all, and even now these guidelines are not very clear. The only thing we know, we will have to implement it if we want to use other social logins, but that's like about it. We don't know if we can use the custom button for the sign in with Apple, or if we do have to stick with the native one, which doesn't behave very nice. We don't know that because it is not in guidelines. So we don't know if we have to display some kind of sign in with Apple button on older than iOS 13, or if we can hide it at all. Again, no mention about this in guidelines. So most of the time, it's just like you have to try to submit your app for the review, and basically then you'll see. Okay, so all in all, I hope I didn't discourage you with this talk from implementing Sign with Apple, but this wasn't the point of this talk. The point of this talk was just to share with you some experience which we have in Eki with implementing Sign with Apple, and I believe that it will get better, just like most of the Apple services. And I believe we as developers will enjoy developing it, and also people using our apps will enjoy using it. So yeah, thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes? Yeah, I have just a very small idea because we use Firebase to manage signing with Apple. But it's basically you send these created credentials you send to the backend. Backend has to handle it with Apple services, and then Apple services respond to your backend and backend to the app. But again, I don't really know about the details on the backend side. So we are using Firebase to manage this. Okay. Well, I think it might fall in the error delegate, most probably. So you will have to handle that in the app, but okay, thank you very much.